In this tutorial, I thought I would concentrate on the Graduated Filters tool. It's one of the most useful, and once you've got to grips with it, you'll be amazed at just what you can do to achieve a balanced image. Ideally, I'd like to capture the scene in camera using the correct strength of filter, but there are times when this simply isn't possible. If I'm out looking for wildlife subjects, for example, I don't want to be burdened with a full-blown filter system. I want to travel as light as possible, and so even though I may have a wide-angle lens with me in case of a landscape opportunity, I know there are a few tricks I can use to obtain a correct exposure when processing the image. On overcast days, when the exposure difference between the sky and land isn't too great, as in this instance, I can expose to the right, ensuring plenty of detail in the reeds, being careful not to blow out the sky, and then correct later in Lightroom. As we look at this photograph, the sky is clearly too light, but by using the Graduated Filter tool, we can bring it back down, revealing detail and interest in the clouds. So let's begin. If we look at the histogram on the top of the picture, you can see just how far right I've exposed. As far to the right as I can go before I start blowing out detail, but it has ensured plenty of detail in the shadow area here. I'm quite happy with the overall exposure at the moment, and it's not something I intend to adjust just yet until I've brought the Graduated Filter into tool. Then I can look at white balance and contrast and the like. To first activate the Graduated Filter tool, we can either click on the icon here, or, as I often do, use the shortcut M. You can see it produces a cross. First of all, I want to stipulate that you cannot just use the Graduated Filter tool in a small portion of the frame. It will always come from the edges, whether it be from the left, from the right, the bottom, or from the top. If you wish to just influence or adjust the exposure in a small area, in the center of the frame for example, you would need to use either the adjustment brush or the Radial Filter. So it will always come from the top or side or bottom edges. You can replicate graduated filters very well indeed with this tool. In fact, I'll go as far to say that unless the exposure difference is too great and that it doesn't fall within the dynamic range of the camera's exposure system, then I won't use a graduated filter. Why use more glass in front of a lens than you have to? I don't own a one-stop graduated filter. I don't see any need. 2-stop and 3-stop are the maximum strengths that I have, and I generally use the Lee medium and hard edged. Medium is a very good compromise, so if I were to either purchase or just take with me one filter out on a trip, it would be a 2-stop medium edge filter. It's neither too soft nor too hard, it falls somewhere in the middle. But the beauty with using the Graduated Filter tool is that you can replicate these. You don't have to make an immediate decision, but of course there are times in the field when you need to. If the exposure for the sky is so great that you can't use high dynamic range methods, if there's water moving or vegetation for example, high dynamic range images where you take more than one photograph of the scene then blend later simply doesn't work because the water is at different stages. And in this situation here as well, it was quite still, but imagine the same scene on a windy day using high dynamic range. You'd have reeds at different stages. So there are times when graduated filters are absolutely paramount, and quite frankly there's something very satisfying about getting it right in camera, looking at the rear screen of your camera and seeing the exposure correct as it is with very little post-production required. But as I said, there are times when you simply have to do without graduated filters if you don't have it with you, or if there's a light drizzle, if it's raining, when you're likely to get water spots on the front of the filter. Then using this method on overcast days we expose to the right, or in situations where you can HDR the image, and by that I mean maybe just 2 images, one where you've exposed for the foreground, one for the sky, and then blend in later, can work very well indeed. So let's get back to what we're doing. I've activated the filter, or by clicking M on the shortcut, and then you simply put the cross wherever you like in the image. You don't have to be too careful at this point, and you just drag it down. By dragging it down you can see that there are 3 lines. In fact, once I let go, Lightroom turns it red, which is very useful indeed. Why does it turn red? Be careful of this. You have to click this area here, Show Selected Mask Overlay. If I unclick that, it's white. I have that clicked. I find it really useful to know exactly the area that I'm exposing for here with a graduated filter, and by moving it up and down you can see the effect. As in the first tutorial, Lightroom does on occasion reduce the exposure by 1/3 of a stop. I don't know why this is. Maybe it's so that you can see a definite a definite effect with the filter, but I'm going to double click that to get it back to 0. As I squeeze and increase the distance between the lines, you can see the effect that I'm creating. The middle is simply the one that you move, and by using, it's the top and the bottom ones that require the most careful attention. Now in a situation like this where I have a definite horizon line, I don't want a soft graduation because this is already correctly exposed, as are the reeds. So I'm going to squeeze the lines in again. You simply take the top using the hand, as you can see here. Once you fall, and you'll always know once you fall on the line because that cross turns into a hand. So you can either increase or decrease the distances. The middle one simply moves the 3 lines together. Okay, so I want these lines really squeezed together to replicate a hard edge graduated filter, and you can see just how definite the beginning and the end is here. I'm then going to hold it down in the middle, bring it down. Now if you've started moving this from the top or from the sides and it ends up being a slight angle and you need the horizon, rather the graduated filter line exactly straight, then click shift on your keyboard. So I'm clicking on this as if I'm to drag it, then clicking on shift, and it will keep it nice and straight. If I take it off and move this area here, you can see how all of a sudden it goes a bit crazy. Don't worry if it produces another graduated filter line like this. This is my original one at the top here, and I can activate them whenever I please. If you find that you've inadvertently done as I've done here, and that is started a new graduated filter, click on it and then click delete, and it gets rid of it immediately. So I can click on that. I've got the show selected mask overlay activated, so I can see exactly where my graduated line starts and finishes. I'm going to click shift and drag it down, and that is nice and straight. I'm going to finish just above the reeds and then take the bottom and then drag it down, and that's just encroached into the reeds a tiny bit here, but I don't want to go too high, otherwise I'm missing the exposure here. So I'm just going to squeeze in a touch and then bring it down again, clicking shift and clicking on that line there, and that is just about held it. I don't want the white on there anymore. I want to adjust the exposure, so I'm going to turn that off, and by clicking the exposure and moving to the left, reducing the exposure, you can see the effect that I'm producing. Quick word of warning here: never make your sky darker than the reflection. You see it so often in magazines and particularly on social media, where I'm sure some photographers wish they could put the sliders up to 11. Too sharp, too contrasty, way too much clarity. It's an Instagram-esque image which might produce lots of likes, but it completely takes away the reality from a photograph. If you want to do that, then that's fine. Not really for me to say what you do or what you don't do, but as a nature photographer I want to keep things, you know, as true to form as I possibly can, although remember, it's your interpretation of the scene. There's nobody to tell you whether it's right or wrong, it's simply your interpretation. And so there might be times, particularly when I'm doing impressionistic images, that I might increase, decrease clarity and go beyond the realms of reality, as it were. I've already introduced intentional camera movement, both vertically or horizontal movement, or multiple exposures, so you've kind of gone beyond that reality stage anyway. So introducing more or less colour, contrast, etc. doesn't really matter. But with a scene like this where I want to keep it true to form, I don't want to overdo things too much, so keep the sky marginally lighter than the reflection itself. Once you start going too dark, you can just see how unrealistic it is. Remember, the reflections are always darker than the sky itself. I'm going to bring this back into the center, and I'm going to reduce the exposure again. It's going a bit too much. So I'm missing a line here in the middle. This area here could do with a touch more exposure, so I'm going to bring this down a touch. Can you see how it's squeezing it in and it's just giving me a touch more exposure in the center? Bring that down, not too much. If you've gone over too far on the reeds here, not to worry, of course you can just bring out the bottom line. Quick tip here that a lot of people don't seem to realise is that if you go over an area with a graduated filter, such as a mountain, tree or reeds in this case, You can correct that graduated area if you just wanted to affect the sky but not the mountain or the reeds by using shadows. If I bring this up, can you see how it's revealing more detail in the reeds? So I'm clicking on that again. I'm happy with the exposure level here, but I'd like a touch more detail where the graduated filter is just encroaching to the top of the reed. So I'm grabbing the shadow tool, just bringing it up, and you can see how it's brought that detail back in. If I use the history tool here, you can see the effect from without the shadow slider activated, or brought up rather, and with, and it's giving you a very nice effect. Now that is quite realistic. I'm reasonably happy with that. I'm going to now take off the graduated filter tool and also lose this area on the left hand side, so I have a bigger panel in which to work. I'd like more contrast, however, in the scene as a whole. We can see if we look at the top of the histogram here how the black and the white points could do with moving over one side or another. You might remember in the first area how we do this. Click on whites or blacks. The overall exposure I'm quite happy with for the moment, as I am with the temperature. I don't want to touch that. Generally speaking, you would go in order here, but that's not to say that you have to. I want to adjust the exposure first and foremost, so I'm going to take the whites firstly. You can see how much room we've got for manoeuvre here. So I'm going to take the whites, I'm going to click on Alt, that turns it black, and then my threshold is when parts become white. Now I've dragged it all the way up, and I haven't clipped any of the whites. That's as far as it will go. I'm then going to take the blacks, and I'm going to drag that as far to the left as I can before it starts appearing. A bit too much, bring it back. Okay, so they are my thresholds. We can see we've now produced a really contrasty image. Bring history back. You can see the difference between that and that. We've kind of gone from one extreme to another, to a picture that was way too soft to one which is now too hard. That's Instagram hard, I would say, but I really want to reduce that, and this is when you go by eye. At this moment I'm quite happy with where the black point is, but the whites really do need to come back down, and this will affect your exposure. It's now made the image a bit dark. I prefer to drag for the overall exposure the histogram at the top. It's far more sensitive and allows me to make minute adjustments far more effectively, strangely enough for whatever reason, than the exposure slider. So I'm going to now drag it to the right a touch and just lighten the overall image, and that's given me a bit more detail in the reeds. Let's see what highlights and shadows tool does. By reducing the highlights, that darkens the sky further, and just the top part of the sky, which is good to know. It means that if I want to darken the sky further, I can maybe just use the highlight tool. However, be aware that when you use shadows and highlight tools, you start to reduce the overall contrast of the scene because you're producing detail in lighter and darker areas. So with sky, I tend not to use the highlights too much, but rather use graduated filter. You retain the contrast because all you're doing is adjusting the exposure. I would like to darken the sky just a little bit more, but not necessarily in this bottom area, but from the top, and this is what I call layering. We've activated and used the graduated filter if ever you wanted to do it. Remember, we have by doing so, and you don't even have to have the show selected mask overlay activated for this. Once you run over that dot, you can see exactly the area that I've affected. But I want to activate that again and produce my own, or rather a separate graduated filter effect here. So I've already done one, but I want to now just affect this top area because my eye is moving towards the top and to the left of the frame. So I'm going to press shift again and I'm going to bring it down. Again, Lightroom has done that, and then minus a third. I'm going to take that off just for now and reduce the exposure, and you see how I'm just going to affect the top of the frame. Look at the difference there. If I move the center point, you can see where it affects the scene, and you can move that down or up. I don't want to bring it too far down because I'm reasonably happy with the exposure here. So you're just looking to where that hand appears, then you know you've got the bottom line. Let's bring that down a touch. Okay, deactivate. Look at the scene again. It's quite nice. It's a touch too dark now for my liking, so I'll bring that to the right just marginally. That's a bit better. Still a touch too light here in the top left. Now when I activate the graduated filter tool here again, Lightroom has once again reduced it by a third of a stop, minus 0.3. I'm going to leave it at that because this is when it becomes quite useful. I want to now just adjust this area here. I want to darken it a touch, maybe just by 1/3 of a stop. So that's what I'm going to do. Do this, click M, take it off. That is just a touch too strong, so I'm going to click it, bring the exposure up just a wee bit. To maybe just -10, unclick again, and now we're getting there. Colour balance wise, I'm quite pleased with it, but it's always interesting to see how Lightroom would produce the white balance here. So very useful to use a picker. Look for a non-pure white area, well, any area here frankly, because there isn't a pure white area, but it was taken around about midday. It wasn't an evening or a morning shot, so there shouldn't be too much colour bias here. And I'm just going to click any area, and this is what Lightroom has made it into, and it's really livened up the reads. If I bring the history panel back, we can see before and after, and I rather like that. Let's have another look before and after. Yeah, I'm inclined to leave it where it is. I'd still like to do a little bit more to the photograph to bring some more detail out into the sky. I might even darken it a fraction, so we can activate the graduated filter tool again. Click that same button, reduce the exposure. Now, because this is very fine, the increments, I will often use the numbers actually. So I'm a minus 1.22 there that you can see. So I'm going to make it 1.35. Let's just darken it a fraction more. Let's go into history. That's how it was, and that's how it is now. So you don't necessarily have to use a slider. You can increase or decrease the exposure by adding numbers, positive, minus numbers, obviously, to darken the frame. And I will often use this in increments of 10s, 15s, 20s to make some really minute adjustments, because it can be quite frustrating sometimes when you're clicking and you're dragging and it goes too far. So I'd like to increase contrast in just the sky, not in the bottom area here. I think that's more than sufficient. There's lots of detail in the bottom, but just the top of the sky. So I'm going to activate the graduated filter tool again, this area, and I just want to increase exposure in the top part of the sky. And we can do this two ways. Either we can increase the contrast by using the contrast slider, or if you want maximum control, using the blacks and the whites. Also clarity will to a degree increase or decrease exposure, and let's see what each do. So this is with the contrast slider, and you can see it is increasing the contrast, not by a massive deal, but it's giving you quite a nice effect actually. Do not poo-poo the use of using Lightroom's overall contrast slider. It's far better than the much earlier versions of Lightroom. The algorithms are such that they understand that you wish to preserve detail in the whites more than you do blacks. So don't forget about, don't not use it on occasion. But by using blacks and whites, we have far more control. I can move the whites over a touch. I can bring the blacks down a wee bit too. Now with the sky, if you want to create a bit more drama without clipping whites, let's bring this back into the center again. You could just bring the black white point down. Okay, look how that's increasing contrast, but it's leaving the whites well alone. We're not losing any detail. Let's look at clarity. Clarity also does it. It increases contrast in the midtones. So there are several ways where you can increase or decrease contrast. But always remember, you don't want to make it unrealistic. We're not looking for an apocalypse type image here, where we're expecting aliens to land at any moment. You see images sometimes where the sky is so unrealistic it looks ridiculous, quite frankly. So what I would urge you to do is do some work, walk away for a few moments, come back, and you'll look at it with fresh eyes. But in this instance, what I'm going to do is I'm going to increase the whites just a touch, and then bring the blacks down. Bring those down to somewhere like that. I'm going to press M. That deactivates the graduated filter tool, and let's see how it's looking. Now you can see all of these adjustments here. That was just to show you what I was doing. So I'm bringing it right down to the white balance, and I'm going to click on the top, and we'll see. In fact, if I click on this arrow here, that will bring the whole picture into the photograph. So that is before contrast was added, that's after. There's quite a big difference, I'm sure you'll agree. Before and after. It still looks realistic, but what we have are nice detail in the clouds. There's not a great else I really want to do here, but I will go through, of course, clarity, detail, vibrancy, and eventually sharpening. So let's look at clarity. Let's see what it does for the overall image. Now I rarely go above 15, 20 here, so I'm just going to dial in 20 and see what it does. Yeah, it's rather nice, and often what I'll do is once I've dialed in 15, 20, 30, usually 20 is a very good starting point, I'll use the backspace button just to take it out again, hit 20 one more time, so it's kind of a before and after. Before, after, it's just added a touch more detail in the read, so I'm going to leave it at 20. Now let's dehaze. Well, this is very useful if you have, well, haze in the photograph. I don't here, so let's see what it does anyway. Can you see how it increases contrast? It's taken away what it considers to be haze, but you know, there are times when even just adding 10 in a haze has really kind of just given it, well, made the image pop a little bit, hasn't it? But I don't want to go overboard, so I'm just going to add in 5 dehaze here. It might be the lens that I was using. I was using an old lens, which nowhere near as sharp as the much more modern optics. So I've just got the clarity there on +20, dehaze on +5. Vibrancy, well, that can go up a touch, but you've got to be careful what it does to the sky. It can often turn the sky in these areas here strange colours, so you need to be aware of that. But I'm going to increase it anyway. So let's say by 30. Let's see what it does. It should liven the reads up a touch. Yes, it does. Okay, I'm not going to touch saturation. In fact, there are times when I'll increase vibrancy, take out a touch of saturation, and this kind of neutralizes it a touch. So effectively what you're doing is by reducing the saturation just a touch by -5, -10, is by taking away the color globally but increasing the saturation by using vibrancy in those lesser detected colors, as it were. So I'm going to leave that, however, on 0 and the vibrancy on +30. So the overall contrast of the image, I'm quite happy with that at the moment, but there's only one way to really find out, and that is to add more contrast and see where you are might be just about right. And as I discussed in the first tutorial, you can use these drop downs, albeit I find them a little bit hard, a little bit strong should I say, but I'm going to click on strong. Well, that is clearly way too much. Look how we lost detail in the blacks here, and it's all become very unrealistic. Let's go back to linear, so without, and then to medium. That's not too bad when it goes into medium. In fact, you could argue that it's brought out more detail in the reads, giving it a touch more punch, and I quite like that. Let's take that out, bring it back in again. I'm quite happy with this, so I'm going to leave that in the photograph. And as I did before, I probably should have done this at the beginning, but I simply forgot, is to click on the lens correction profile. So enable profile correction. See how that's corrected both vignetting and barrel distortion. Click on that and remove chromatic aberration. Chromatic aberration are colours in mauve and green that affect straight areas of the scene. So if you have pylons, a wall, buildings, it tends to be more pronounced than it does in a photograph like this. Now, something which profile corrections had, which I rather liked, was that it gave, because it took out the vignetting, is that it held the picture into the center. If I click on this, you can see how the corners have lightened somewhat. Now I want to hold the viewer into the center of the shot, and it's even lightened the photograph just a wee bit as well. So I'm going to bring the slider back up to the top. I'm going to reduce the exposure by maybe just a quarter of a stop or so. About there. Okay, yep, that's rather nice. And by bringing in the history tool here, you can see that there is a presets button too, so we can click on that, and under vignetting we have various strengths. Now on the latest version of Lightroom, just as you roll over them, you can see the effect from heavy to medium to light to none. Okay, so we have no vignetting, and then we have light. Now I rather like the light version. It hasn't made the image unrealistic. You can't tell that a vignette has been used, which is important, I think, in our landscape shots. Please don't overdo it. It can look, if you notice it, or rather, if others notice it, then it's simply too strong. So I rather like it on light, and that's where I'm going to leave it. Bring the image back in again, and I'm quite happy with the overall look of that. And to finish off, we would sharpen the photograph. I'm going to zoom in 100% here. The image anyway looks nice and sharp, but I'm going to see if just by sharpening it up a wee bit adds touch more bite in those reeds. I'm going to click on Alt, which turns it into black and white, which makes viewing the sharpening process a little easier. And then I'm going to bring it all the way up, and you see that is too much. Bring it down, it's too soft. Click, Control, turns it into black and white. Now I'm just going to move it up until it gives me a touch of sharpness. I would say about there. Bring that back down, and this is the beauty of Lightroom, is that by using masking I can click Alt again, or rather, yeah, click Alt as I did previously. So I said Control, I do apologise, when I'm moving the amount you click Alt and then you slide. So I'm going to click on Alt again, and on masking, those areas where sharpening doesn't affect the photograph, it turns black, and it leaves those areas where it does affect the sharpening white. So I would say to about here, because I want the reeds to be sharpened but not the sky. Let's bring that back, and it sharpens the sky, etc. Now by increasing the sharpening in the sky, it brings noise into the equation, or it can do rather. Now I want a bit of sharpening going on in the sky because I like the definition of the clouds. So I'm not going to go all the way down to where the sky isn't affected. If I had a very bland pure white or pure blue sky, then I wouldn't need any sharpening required, but I'm just going to bring that down to maybe about here. So it's affected the reeds, the whole of the reed area, plus some of the clouds, particularly the edges of the clouds. And that is the image sharpened. I can zoom in. If we bring the history back, scroll down, so before, after. And you can see how it's made quite a difference there from before to after. It's really crisped up the reeds. Bring that back down. Okay, so I'd say I'm quite happy with this photograph now. There's not a great deal more that I would do. I'm going to show you a little trick which I show those that come on my workshops, which I learned to use a few years ago now, and I find it really useful when I'm working out the tonal balance of an image. We look at a photograph like this as a photograph, and we tend to be drawn to the main subject, which is the reeds and the reflections, and we tend to forget or ignore bright and dark areas around the frame. But a very simple trick by turning the image upside down will then just reveal the photograph as a range of tonal values and not as a photograph. And I do this by clicking on Control and then the brackets, whether it be the open or closed brackets. It doesn't really matter, but I'm going to turn it upside down. So now we just look at this as, well, as a range of tonal values now. And as I'm looking at the photograph, I can see that the very bottom area, and I'm talking about as we're looking at the photograph, the bottom area is still a touch light. My eye is gravitating towards that lighter area. Also, I'm wondering if as we're looking at the photograph, there's a small patch of reeds on the right hand side which is also just a touch dark. So I'm now going to right the photograph, and I'm going to darken just ever so slightly this top portion of the frame by clicking M, Shift, bring it down just the top to about here. Taking that off, turn it upside down. That's much better. Writing it the right way up. This area here I found was a little bit too light. Now, in order to lighten this, I'm going to use the adjustment brush, but I could use the Radial Filter as well. In fact, I'm going to use the Radial Filter here. I wasn't going to use this today. I was going to perhaps save that for a later tutorial, but I think it would be very useful here. I just want to affect this small area on the right hand side. So I'm going to activate the Radial Filter, I'm not going to go into too much detail about this filter here and now because this is really a tutorial about graduated filters, but it's very simple. I'm moving it around the area I want to affect, I want to lighten. I can stretch it out, I can bring it in, just affect this area. Again, Lightroom has done this, it's reduced the exposure by 1/3 of a stop. I'm not going to use the overall exposure slider here because I don't want these areas, the sky, to be affected. So I'm just going to bring the shadows to the right. I'm going to increase shadows and this will lighten that area. There. Let's bring that back to how it was. Increase the shadows to about there. Okay, deactivate the radial filter. Let's bring history to where we were, which is about here. And that is without radial filter and with. And look how it's just added a touch more detail in that small area. Makes a big difference. It's one of the most useful tools I find. And if I just wanted to affect the reeds and not any other part, i.e. the sky, remember that I said in the beginning that the graduated filter can only come from the sides, from the top, from the bottom, but never just a small area in the center. So there are two ways that you can do this, as I mentioned, either by the adjustment brush or the radial filter. The radial filter would handle this situation well if I wanted to lighten or darken just the reeds. Activate the radial filter, make whatever shape you wish. It's always going to be a little circular like this. Again, Lightroom has done that, it's reduced the exposure by 1/3. Up with shadows or the overall exposure, you can see increase exposure, decrease the exposure, and it just affects that middle area. But if I want to do it subtly, invariably I'll either use the highlights or shadows. So up with the shadows, and it just increases the exposure of the reeds, but not the sky. Deactivate the radial filter to finish. So I think that's about it. I'm quite happy. Just before we export, if you watched the first tutorial, you'll see that I discussed the influence that changing the background can make as to the overall exposure of the photograph. I'm going to reduce the size of the picture so it has a nice thick border around it to 1/8. In fact, that's quite small, so let's see what 1/4 does. Yeah, let's bring it back down to 1/8. Okay, that gives me a nice thick border around it. If I'm exporting for print, which invariably has a white border around it or will be placed against a light coloured wall, I'll right click and white. And you'll notice how the picture has suddenly turned a bit darker than I had it, and that's merely an optical illusion. I've got a big white area around the picture which I gravitates towards, and whatever's in the center turns a little bit darker. Conversely, if I right click and turn it black, you can see now how it looks more correctly exposed. So depending on my usage of the image, if it's for print, I will do final adjustments with a white background, and just by again dragging the exposure to the right, I can lighten the picture just a fraction to how I had it, or to how I want it rather, and that is now a correct exposure for print. By right clicking to black, if I were exposing or rather exporting for projection for a lecture, I would find it a touch too light, so I'm going to bring that back 1/3 of a stop or so. But for social media and for general processing, where I just want to get a middle exposure, so to speak, an exposure to work with, I would always start on medium grey. And then we'll go simply to File, Export, and then you'd make the appropriate adjustments. I'll just run those down, but then of course you can just choose whichever folder you want to take it to. JPEG, because social media you don't want to export to TIFF. Quality wise, 90 or 80 generally is what I'd input. sRGB is the correct color space for using on screen. Resize to fit long edge 900, well usually I'd only do 800, 72 pixels per inch, and then sharpening wise, if it's for my website I have to put it on high. That's simply how my website works, but for social media, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook and the like, sharpen for screen standard I find to be gives me just about the right amount of sharpness, because remember you've already added sharpness in the photograph, so you don't need to add much more. If you do so, then you'll find that that your images simply look far too sharpened. So I'm quite happy with that photograph, but even just while we've been discussing there, I would say that that looks just a little bit too contrasty for my liking, and this is one of the benefits that you'll get from walking away from the situation, coming back to it, or visiting some websites, and then you just come back to it with fresh eyes. To me, that now looks too contrasty, and if I remember correctly, I use the medium contrast preset here. Let's take that off, and that looks just a little bit better. Let's have a look at the history from where we were to where we are now. Let's bring the image in, and that to me now looks a lot more lifelike. It could do with a touch more contrast, and I'm just going to add 15 contrast here. So what that does, and that's just give me a little. Remember, don't ignore the overall contrast slider. It can work really well. Of course, if you want absolute control, you can use the tonal curve here, rising and lowering various areas, but I want an overall contrast increase here, both in the sky and in the reeds. And as I say, the algorithm within Lightroom is very, very good. So even if you just add 10 here, it adds a bit of bite. I'm going to add it 15, and that is much more acceptable than where it was, which was originally there, I think. Yeah, looks much more acceptable. And if you want to see it full frame, or rather covering the whole computer screen, press F, and that will give you the entire photograph. F again, brings it back down. So that concludes the use of using a graduated filter. I hope you've learnt a little bit, but do practice. It's a tool that I find incredibly useful, and much like using the adjustment brush and the radial filter, is one that over time you'll recognise what parts of the picture require it and which do not. But above all else, don't overdo it. Come back to the photograph time and again, perhaps over a period of 20-30 minutes or more after a cup of tea. Just as I did, you'll see it with fresh eyes, and you may well find that you've over sharpened it or made it too contrasty. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter really, as long as you recognise that and you keep improving upon what you've learned and what you've been doing. So thank you for watching, and perhaps I'll do another in the future. Thank you.